Thank you, everyone. Welcome to episode 10 of the Truth Channel, and we are continuing reading the crucifixion and death of Jesus Christ. It's such a good book. Alright, so we're going to continue in the chapter, What Was a Typical Crucifixion Like? We are about a quarter of a way through the chapter, so let's continue reading. Once the crucifixion area was reached, the victim would be offered a drink of wine mixed with myrrh to act as a mild painkiller. The drink was charitable service performed by the Association of Women in Jerusalem. They offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Mark 15:23. The victim would then be nailed to the crossbeam. The nails would be driven through the wrists, not the palms, as these would not support the weight of the body. The crossbar would be raised and placed on an upright post, where the victim's heels would then be nailed to the post. Once crucified, a victim would live for a period ranging from a few hours to a few days. How long he lived depended mostly on how severe the scourging was. If no one claimed the body, it would be left on the cross to be eaten by predatory animals. The family could, however, claim the body for burial. In this case, a Roman soldier would pierce the chest with a sword or spear to make sure the victim was dead. What actually kills the victim? The initial scourging would weaken the victim, cause massive blood loss, probably include shock by the victim. By the time the victim had carried the crossbar to the crucifixion area, he would be exhausted. Once up on the cross, the victim would have his body weight suspended by their arms. In this position, it is difficult to completely exhale. The victim could take shallow breaths for a while, but eventually would be forced to push himself up to take a full breath. At this point, three things happen. The victim's weight is now fully supported by his feet. The nails through his feet would likely hit two major nerves running through the area. The result would be excruciating pain in the legs. The nails in the wrist would be likely to pierce the main nerve running through the arm. As the victim pushed up to breathe, the wrist would rotate against the nail, irritating the nerves and causing intense pain in the arms. Some authorities also believe that the crucifixion position would also desolate the shoulders or elbow. Any movement would aggravate the pain from these injuries. These wounds on the victim's back from the scourging would push up against the rough part of the centerpiece. This would reopen the wounds, leading to more pain and blood loss. The combination of pain would quickly force the victim to lower himself back down. Eventually, the victim would no longer be able to push himself up and would suffocate. The shock from blood loss due to the scourging would hasten this process. In some cases, the victim's legs would be broken to finish him off. This would prevent the victim from being able to raise himself up, and he would suffocate. He would suffocate in a matter of minutes. Specifics of Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus' crucifixion mostly followed the standard procedure, although there are some differences. These differences help account for the fact that he died almost relatively short period in a relatively short period of time on the cross. Among being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat like drops of blood falling to the ground. Luke 22:44. There is a condition called hematidrosis. Hematidrosis, which occurs in people under extreme physical or emotional stress. The blood vessels in their sweat glands rupture and leak blood into their sweat. This effect is one of sweating blood. Several authorities believe that this is a plausible explanation for what happened to Jesus. Although the loss of blood would not be significant, it shows that he was under extreme stress, which would have weakened him physically. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking him and beating him. Luke 22:63. Then some began to spit on him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy." And the guards took him and beat him. Mark 14:65. They spat in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him. Matthew 26:67. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby struck him on the face. "Is this the way you answered the high priest?" he demanded. John 18:22. Before the scourging and crucifixion, Jesus was beaten by his guards, which would weaken him. In addition, he would have had no sleep the night before and walked back and forth from trial to trial. A certain man from Cyrene, named Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. Mark 15:21. As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. Matthew 27:32. As they led him away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. Luke 23:26. Typically, a prisoner carried his own cross to the crucifixion site. The fact that Simon was pressed into carrying Jesus' cross suggests that Jesus was too weak to carry his own cross after the beating. In preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath, so as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked if Jesus had already died. Mark 15:42-44. Since the Jewish Sabbath would begin at sunset, it was important that the bodies not be left up, as Jewish law required that they be buried by the Sabbath. Note that Pilate is surprised that Jesus is already dead. Now it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath, because the Jews did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath. They asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. The soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. John 19:31-32. As mentioned earlier, breaking of the legs of a crucified person would cause suffocation within minutes, because they would not be able to raise themselves up and push themselves up to breathe. But when they came to Jesus and found he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. John 19:33-34. Again, this was the typical crucifixion practice. to stab the victim to make sure he was dead before releasing him to the relatives. The water that John describes as flowing is probably serious pleural and pericardial fluid that would build up from shock and blood loss. This fluid would tend to accumulate in the chest cavity and lungs. A jar of wine and vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge on it, put the sponge on the stalk of the hyssop plant, and lifted it up to Jesus' lips. John 19:29. A second drink, which he accepts moments before his death, is described as wine and vinegar. 2 points are important to note. The drink was given on the stalk of a hyssop plant. Remember that these events occurred at the feast of the Passover. During this feast, Exodus 12:22, hyssop was used to apply the blood of the Passover lamb to the wooden doorpost of the Jews. The two aspects of Jesus' death have been the source of great controversy, namely the nature of the wound in his side and the cause of his death after only several hours on the cross. The Gospel of John describes the piercing of Jesus' side and emphasizes the sudden flow of blood and water. Some authors have interpreted the flow of water to be some fluid from the lining inside the abdomen or urine from the abdominal midline perforation of the bladder. However, the Greek word used by John, pleura, clearly denoted literally and often implied the ribs. Therefore, it seems probable that the wound in the chest was well away from the abdominal midline. Although the side of the wound was not designated by John, it is traditionally and has been depicted on the right side. Supporting this tradition, the fact is that a large flow of blood and water would be more likely with a perforation of the heart near the distended and thin-walled right arterium and ventricle than the thick-walled and contracted left ventricle. Although the side wound of the wound may never be established with certainty, the right seems more probable than the left, as the Shroud of Turin shows that there was a piercing on the right side of the body, and traces of blood and water were found. The water probably represented fluid draining from the tissues lining the lung and heart, and would have preceded the flow of blood and been similar in volume than blood. Perhaps in the setting of low blood volume and impending acute heart failure, lung and heart tissue drainage due to cellular imbalances may have developed and would have added to the volume of apparent water. The blood, in contrast, may have originated from the right atrium or the right ventricle, or perhaps the collection of blood from the lining around the heart. Jesus' death only after 3 to 6 hours on the cross surprised even Pontius Pilate. The fact that Jesus cried out in a loud voice and then bowed his head and died suggests the probability of